Hello, everyone. Welcome to Or This. This is my Monday morning quarterbacking of the scriptures and the sermon from the previous Sunday. And this video is for Sunday, October 27th, which is the observance of Reformation Day. I apologize as I picked up something this week in a cold or sinuses or allergies or something, and it seems like I'm losing my voice. So I thought I'd better do this video before my voice is gone completely. So the scriptures for this week were Jeremiah 31 to 34, Psalm 46, Romans 3, 19 through 28, and John 8, 31 to 36. So, one of the thoughts I had for the children's message, based on the gospel, where in John chapter 8, verse 31, Jesus says, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples." The word continue was translated from the Greek word meno. But that word could also be translated remain in or dwell in. So the beginning of John's Gospel, chapter 1, it says in the prologue, "And the word became flesh and lived among us." And it was the same Greek word, lived, dwelt. I think it's the Message translation of the Bible where it says, put up a tent. But that's the image that John's Gospel was trying to go for in using this word. I don't know why it was translated differently depending on where it appeared, but it goes back to that first chapter of John where it says, "The word became flesh and dwelt among us, lived among us, put up a tent, moved into the neighborhood." I think that might have been the Message translation. The image that the gospel is trying to give us is God living in the midst of with God's people. So we're studying Leviticus in Bible study, and one of the commandments that God gave to God's people in the wilderness was to build this place called a tent of meeting. The tent of meeting was going to be the place where sacrifices where animals were sacrificed to God, and where God's presence would dwell. Now there were certain people, priests, who were set apart to do the work of being God's presence and sacrificing the animals to God. But the idea is that God kind of needed a place to be, to draw near to God's people. So it's called a tent of meeting in some places. Some places it's called the tabernacle. So that was God's tent. That was the place where God would rest, God's presence. And it was in the midst of the camp of God's people. And this was the way that God lived among God's people. So we're supposed to remember that image when we hear John 1 and it says, "And the word became flesh and dwelt, tabernacled, lived, abided among us." So that when we hear that word then later on in John's Gospel, and it comes up in different places, but here it's, "If you dwell in my word, if you tabernacle in my word, if you remain in, abide in." That's an image of being in the presence of. Now I said about the idea, if you continue in my word, is not only to think of a person like going through a book, although for us it is that, because we weren't in Jesus' bodily presence. So we came a lot later and we have the Gospels, and so we study Jesus' words in the Gospels. But don't forget, where did Jesus promise to be? Well, How are we in the presence of Jesus? Holy Communion, Jesus promises to be present whenever we gather to receive the bread and wine. Jesus' presence is there. When we worship, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I will be there. And the story of from Matthew, when Jesus talks about caring for it's the parable of the sheep and the goats. And whenever you do this, do these, whenever you visit the sick or visit the imprisoned, whenever you feed the poor, whenever you clothe the naked, you are doing these things to me. So whenever we are helping those in need, those are the places that Jesus talks about as being where his presence is in our midst. And of course, Jesus is with us, with us in our lives every day. But so those things, along with Jesus' teachings, are ways that we today can continue in Jesus' word and be Jesus' disciples. And I kind of want to give it this image. So I was debating about 2 ideas for a children's message, and I went with the one that went with the first reading from Jeremiah 31 to 34, where it talks about God writing God's law on the hearts, rather than saying, know the Lord. God says, I'm going to write my law within our heart and within their hearts. So I talked with the kids about that. The other thing is, my daughter has a little bluey tent. It's just a small little 1-person tent. She could go in it and sit in there and do stuff. Can't do a whole lot, but it's one kind of place where you can be, just where kids can be close, like, and confined in a space. So I thought about bringing that as like a picture of Jesus, God, of remaining in. It's like a tent. It's like being in it, like you're kind of immersed in it. Your whole body is in it. Everything is in the tent. And that this idea of continuing in Jesus' words or abiding in Jesus' word, it's kind of like being enveloped in the love of God that has been revealed through Jesus, and a sense of knowing that for our lives, but also knowing that in the way in which we live every day. I also, though, don't want that to give us too much of an individual sense of faith. I mean, certainly each of us individually, we have faith within us, given to us by the Spirit. But we also need to picture that tent being a little bit bigger than my daughter's little bluey tent, because the place that Jesus dwells is much bigger than that little tent with us. As much as it's a big tent or bigger than any tent we have, God's presence is like a tent that covers all people, that includes all people. In other words, God is present with us throughout the whole world. God is with God's creation, God's people. God is with us, yes, but it's not like God's with us through Christ, but not with them. The idea is that God is with all of us. And those images I mentioned before about Holy Communion, whenever 2 or 3 are gathered for worship, whenever we are serving those in need, these are all places that Jesus promised to be, which are outside of, may not be necessarily a place where we personally are, but when we're serving a person in need, that means Jesus is with the person in need too. So God's presence is widespread over all people, not just me, not just you. However, the image that we are to have is this idea of it's something that we live in every day. That is, like I said, our lives are kind of caught up in it, enveloped in it. Our world, though, is enveloped in the presence of God, regardless of what we might be seeing around us. That's a great reminder to look for God in various places around us, because God has enveloped the world through Christ on the cross to remind us that God's presence is with us no matter what. And so we dwell in the presence of Christ and are constantly reminded of the ways of God's love, that it is love that is meant to be shared amongst us and all people that we encounter. And so we together dwell in the presence of a God who dwells near us in this world. So those are some thoughts I have. Feel free to share your comments, and thank you so much for watching. God bless.